welcome everyone to our webinar on post-pandemic possibilities. We're really excited to be joined by four incredible leaders. We were saying earlier, from sea to shining sea. We have leaders from Alaska, California, and New York here to talk about what we've learned over the past few months and some of the possibilities moving forward. I'm pleased to introduce Laura Kelley, the Chief Academic Officer from Syracuse City School District, as well as Manami Tezuka, who's the Director of Professional Development at Syracuse City School District. And my name is Christina Strunk. I'm a Senior Design Principal at Education Elements. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Drew, to introduce the rest of our panel.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, from sea to shining sea. My name is Drew Shantz with the Ed Elements team, and I'm pleased to introduce Melanie Hadaway. She's the Executive Director of Teaching and Learning in the Fairbanks North Star Borough School District up in Alaska. And then in my current state of California, just a couple hours away, we have Phil Neufeld from the Fresno Unified School District here to chat with us today. Welcome to you both, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So throughout this time, feel free to add any questions into the chat. We'll have some time at the end to get to those questions. But we'll start out with Gabby asking our first question.
Yeah, we're so excited to have this panel here today. We can't thank you all enough for being here. We know there's a ton of competing priorities at the end of this school year. But we actually want to start with thinking about some celebrations that we've had in an unprecedented year. So we're going to talk about some wins. For our panelists, what are some unexpected wins that you experienced this past year? And Manami and Laura, if we can start with you sharing what's happening in Syracuse, we'll go from there.
Go ahead, Laura.
Hi. I think one of our biggest wins is that we have built a community in a time where we've really been forced to be separated. And Manami, I feel like she should get most of the credit for that around the professional communities that have been developed. She could certainly speak to what she's put in place on our Wednesdays every day, or I'm sorry, every week of the school year this year. But I think also in terms of building community, we've learned some ways to engage with our families and with our students in ways that we never really thought of before. I think despite the fact that we've been forced to be farther apart, we've figured out ways to really come closer together. And that's been really exciting. And I think for me, unexpected.
I'll just add to that. One of the unexpected wins was we have struggled for years to get people to integrate technology effectively. And this year forced us all to do a really spectacular job with that. And everybody at this point, I'm pretty confident to say that every teacher in our district can now use technology appropriately and effectively. And that's a huge win for us because it really took something this big to make that happen.
Love that.
May I throw out one more win? Yeah, just one more thing that I think for me personally, from a perspective of, the Chief Academic Officer perspective, is that we partnered with you all at Elements, right, to think about what our virtual program would look like, to really offer something incredible to our virtual learners. And for the first time in a really long time, every child actually has access to really high quality Tier 1 instruction. We've put these demonstration lessons out there. We have our teachers learning how to use them every week. And really, even though this has just been incredibly difficult, everything since last March, we're at a place, we have a foundation by which everyone understands what high quality Tier 1 instruction looks like, from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And that's a big win for us.
I love that, Laura and Manami. Thanks for sharing first. And Phil or Melanie, any other wins that you want to share that are happening in your districts?
Go ahead.
I can, I had some of the same ones, the embracing of technology, whether they like it or not. The other win for us has been, we've really been working to shift to competency-based instruction and focusing on those competencies as opposed to just covering a textbook. And so because of the, we started in remote learning, teachers were really having to rethink their curriculum. We had some interesting schedule shifts that required them to think about curriculum differently. And they also had to change their grading. So, in the beginning, they were asking, how do I do participation points if I'm remote learning? So we were able to have that conversation around what do grades really mean and not mean. And so that we had been trying to get some traction with that, and that's been kind of exciting to see.
I tell you, every time I'm on one of these webinars, the idea flow is inspiring, and we take things away. So I think the community of practice has, for us, went beyond the grade level in schools, and also in these sort of conversations, we can see our community of practice extending even further. I just got to honor a couple quick things here. A proven ability of our students, our teachers, our staff, our families, and our systems to adapt and change like probably never before. We've had really 3 shifts in pedagogy and teaching practices and situations over the last 2 years. Many of these adaptations will remain, but what will most importantly remain is that knowledge that we can make the appropriate shifts where necessary. We've really honed our professional learning and the content and delivery of that with Ed Elements, and that's been super. And also we've recognized that the digital shift isn't about online classrooms only or digital classrooms and digital learning apps. It's also about virtual schooling. It's about student safety. So we have adopted Gaggle, for example, and we're also gathering tons of digital signals from systems at huge scale in a project, what's called Project Constellation, that we do with Microsoft and some other ministries of education. The last piece I'll talk about here, I call it connect to learn. That knowledge that we have to solve better for connecting students, for learning beyond the school, and for whole person growth that isn't just about what's happening in the classroom. And we're having to lean together with community-based organizations, anchor institutions, our Public Utilities Commission to solve for that disproportional cellular service in areas with high poverty and the inadequate and unaffordable broadband. We have to change that across our country, both in urban and rural areas, and that's an important one. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we go. So that's important to make sure every student, wherever they're at, can have the competency-based learning, the pathways, and the rich learning experiences that students already have had over the last 20 years if they're in other parts of town.
I love that, Phil. Some of the big themes that I heard are this idea of a shift in mindset around technology and leveraging it in different ways. And also thinking about how we had to restructure how we build community and a sense of belonging. So really appreciate you all sharing those wins. I'm going to pass it over to Drew for our second question.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. Mel, I'm going to start with you for this question here. We talked about some wins and some celebrations that have gone on, despite the fact that we've also encountered some challenges. Wondering from you up in Fairbanks, how might we take some of the lessons learned from those wins, from those wins, and scale them to continue to support success across your district?
So our district is 100 miles from our farthest school out to our other farthest school out. So we're bigger than some states. And one of our, as was mentioned earlier, the ability to connect, and we were able to connect teachers from different schools around best practices, around technology, some virtual drop-ins and sort of learning walks through that platform. And that is something that we've realized we really want to make sure we deliberately structure in the future. We talk about silos, and I think really the pandemic and these connections helped us realize that we need to break those down among teachers, and then that spreads up as opposed to breaking them down at the district level and bringing it back into teachers. I think the other takeaway was that we had teachers who were really invigorated by change. So we have opened some new, we're going to roll out a K-12 e-learning school next year, and I had almost 20 applicants for one online social studies position. And many of them were teachers who have been in the district for 20 years, all at one school, who verbalized that I realize change is kind of fun and I can do it and it's invigorating. And so I've been having conversations about how do we create deliberate opportunities for teachers to try something different when we and embrace their energy for change and build on that.
Thanks for sharing that, Mel. And speaking of creating, kind of leveraging the enthusiasm behind virtual learning, I'll toss it back over to Laura and Manami over in Syracuse, because we are working with you, Laura, as you started to mention, on building up a virtual high school experience for students in your district. So talk us through either that or some other lessons that you're hoping to scale across the district as we move into the next school year. Not all at once.
No, I know. We're just trying to be polite to each other and not talk over top of one another. So I think the lessons that we've learned about the wins and taking things to scale is that we need to listen to the students. The children are the ones who give us the best ideas about what works for them and what doesn't. And that's part of the reason why we are partnering with y'all again on a virtual academy. It's not a huge subset of our student population, but enough to warrant us really thinking about providing a virtual academy moving forward that supports children who are thriving throughout the pandemic with this virtual learning approach. And how do we create those kinds of connections that we're so used to having in a more typical school year in a virtual school? We want to look at a competency-based virtual high school and really serve our students in a different way. One thing that we do try here in Syracuse is to offer up different options, and we tend to refine those options when we get the student feedback and input.
Yeah, I love that quote. I think someone in the YouTube chat actually called it out. The children are the ones who give us the best ideas. That's absolutely true. And thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. I think we're gonna hop over to our next question, and we'll start off with Phil for this one. But Christina, do you want to walk us through the next one?
Absolutely. So something that we've been thinking about as we reflect on the past few months is this idea of taking a magnifying glass to examine what are the things that maybe could have been prevented or could have been different. So Phil, if you'd like to share a little bit about what are some of the things, the challenges that you might have faced that could have been prevented?
The could have been prevented is the key word here, because there were lots of surprises that we couldn't have imagined until we were in that space. But I think I'll just go to the asset-based comment first. We were ready because we had prepared over the last 5 years with a personalized blended learning program that included real strong supports from education elements. And so when it came to who's ready with these teaching practices that integrates technology, that has routines and structures that work regardless of whether you're online learning or concurrent learning, we were ready with that. So that whole notion of reimagining, redesigning, and being ready is key. But I'll go to one other one that, from a magnifying glass standpoint, I've asked in our community here. What can we have done between 2000 and 2020 to better prepare for equitable access to digital learning beyond the school, or even in our schools, right? And this includes things like better broadband franchise agreements, policies around internet service providers delivering a better basic service, investments in infrastructure. And the same kind of question could be applied to other areas of our systems that we want to make sure we're at a different place in 2030. So then we ask ourselves, what must we do in the next 1 to 5 years, in 5 to 10 years, so every student in whether it's their homes, their parks, as they're going between school, can get access to rich digital learning experiences. And I think that same, your magnifying notion, and making sure we don't find ourselves surprised again. I presume there could be a good rock song for that. Let's make sure we don't find ourselves surprised again in 2030.
Thanks for that, Phil, and happy to co-write that song with you, although I don't know how good my musical talent is. But Manami, thinking about some of the things that maybe you've discovered with that magnifying glass, what are some challenges that maybe could have been prevented in your experience?
I think one of the things about this pandemic is that it really did magnify any areas where we had any weakness at all. And one of the things that really stands out to me is just that our communication structures were not great. And it could have, a lot of the miscommunications and misunderstandings could have been prevented had we had the right structures in place. we also found that we have a lot of tools that we can communicate with that we were not leveraging and that now we are leveraging. It also highlighted just how little communication was happening on a regular basis between teachers and families, and not just teachers and families, but just the district as a whole as well. And I think that this really opened up a lot of doors to building those relationships and making sure that communication was frequent and ongoing between the schools and families. It was really interesting to see parents sitting there with their students in school, in class, virtually, and really sometimes for the first time hearing what class is like and seeing friends and being able to see our students' pets and brothers and sisters. So I think that for us, like that communication piece and how important it is, and that we really do need to work hard on those structures, make sure that they're in place, and we're hoping to keep that going as well.
Thanks for sharing, Manami. And I think there are a couple of themes that are already coming up around access and communication. Mel, in your experience in Fairbanks, what really resonates with you? What have you seen looking through your magnifying glass?
Well, I think we got to the place where many of the others have gotten as well. We really started in a basic way in that our district has always given teachers a lot of autonomy with adopted curriculum materials. So we have our adopted curriculum, which we sort of see as separate those competencies from the adopted materials. And we realized that the issues that caused when last year we had, entire small schools that weren't using the English language arts curriculum and therefore didn't have any digital access for their students. So parents made it really clear that that was problematic, so we were able to start to, I don't want to say rein in, but start to really have a conversation about why it's important to start with those baseline adopted materials so that teachers can have conversations across their schools and districts, so that we can provide good tech support so that they can switch very quickly back and forth from in-person learning to online learning. So, that has been Drew and other folks at Elements who have worked up here know that that's been sort of an interesting conversation where people are like, really, they don't require anyone to follow the curriculum. And so this natural sort of like, oh my gosh, we do need to be on the same page has been really very helpful, I think. And that could have been prevented, I think, if we had figured out a way to make those realities known a little bit earlier.
Thanks for sharing. And I see some comments from YouTube that's really resonating with other people who are watching. And thinking about this idea of the magnifying glasses, really exposing what we could change and how we can go in different directions next. So thank you all for sharing those perspectives. I'm going to turn it over to Gabby for the next question.
Yeah, I love the comment that just came through about the idea that we're exposing weaknesses, but it's also really exciting knowing we sort of have like a benchmark to start making some changes. So along those lines, this is going to go to you, Manami and Laura, first. When we're thinking about all the lessons that we've learned, we might actually fall into the pitfall of wanting to change everything at once. And so would love to hear your advice for, from your experience in Syracuse, what has the ripest opportunity for change?
She's so silly. It's hard not to want to change everything all at once. It's really, really hard. But I think that probably the ripest opportunity for change for us really does go back to that idea of what high quality tier 1 instruction looks like. Having some vision of that, some expectations, some common sets of resources and tools and peer support in how you bring that to life in both an in-person classroom and a virtual environment is really the biggest opportunity for change here for us in Syracuse in terms of my desperate desire to have improved student achievement outcomes. I think that's really, this is, like I said before, this has just been such a difficult year and plus, but we we now know what it could look like for all students, and we are so eager here, in the best of ways and with the best like hearts and minds to try to intervene and meet kids where they're at. And I think we've finally seen some ways to have that high level of rigor and still meet the kids where they're at and bring them up to provide those scaffolds to where they really need to be so that they can participate in high quality and rigorous instruction.
Love that, Lori. What about you, Manami? Yeah.
Sorry, I think I'm just thinking about our teachers right now, just from a professional learning lens. We really saw how much teachers want to share and learn from and with each other, and I think that for us that has been a huge opportunity for change. Like we have all sorts of plans now for how do we create these teacher leadership pathways and roles that are authentic and really train teachers up to be leaders, but still value that instructional piece and keeping people in classrooms as well, and making sure that we're visiting each other and really setting up opportunities for that sharing and learning. So I think that is one of the other things that we're excited about.
What about you, Mel? What's happening in Fairbanks? What's the ripest opportunity for change there?
So we have worked with Ed Elements really to shift our curriculum practices and our revision cycle to really focus on competencies. And that idea that, we could really focus on those big picture skills that are high leverage that go across time. And so teachers this year really understood the fact that they weren't going to be able to cover the content, and they really needed to step back and think what's essential for kids to learn and how are we going to teach them that in a remote and in a hybrid environment. Going forward to next year, we've been able to have really rich conversations around, that one teacher expressed that, he was feeling like, well, next year I've got to cram in all of my typical normal content plus the stuff they missed last year. So we were able to springboard off of that and really talk about, why would we want to do that? Let's still focus on those competencies, identifying where students are in the fall, and then figuring out how to help them learn what's essential. So being able to really structure conversations around student learning, as opposed to pacing guides or grading of competencies versus grading of compliance, and some of those kind of what I see as sort of those foundational shifts to how we talk about education and how we see ourselves as educators. And so we're excited to see some of the excitement around those next fall.
Yeah, Mel, I appreciate the framing around, moving from compliance to something else. And I think frequently what we get in place of that is a level of creativity and collaboration from students. So that sounds very exciting for, I'm sure, a lot of people watching this right now. Phil, what about you? What's happening on the West Coast? What's the ripest opportunity for change?
And to just honor the conversation that's happened so far, there's a lot of opportunities, so the challenge will be prioritizing that. And I'll frame it within the notion that you innovate inside the box, inside the context, until the box starts to change its shape and color. And our teachers and staff as well need to be honored. And so it's really now, how do we take that community of practice that in the networks that have existed during these last 2 years, quite frankly, and find those exemplar practices and find ways to share that out and create that space so that can continue in ways that moves beyond the grade level and beyond the school itself to reach out across our system. I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage the digital content, devices, and analytics that exist as a way to support high quality Tier 1 instruction through structured routines, gradual release of responsibility, while at the same time understanding where each of the students are at and having them be able to use adaptive learning tools that honor where they're at, their strengths, and at the same time also build in the skills necessary for their life journey as part of the not just the career tech ed, but across our system. So the challenge will be figuring out what, to the point earlier about what are those essentials, but really focus on students in a way that we couldn't before. There's things that we're introducing next year that teachers really just wouldn't have the time to do normally, but because of AI, adaptive learning, they can actually see data in the moment, do groupings based on that data, and students will know where they're at as well and able to own and drive their learning. So some really rich opportunities going forward, as long as we continue to fan the flame of the innovations that teachers have, and the growth that teachers themselves have, and quite frankly, their variability, their strengths, what's unique among their gifts as they land back to a new normal.
I love that, Phil. I especially love this shift in not just thinking about personalizing the experience for students, but also thinking about our teachers and our staff as well. Drew's going to keep it on the West Coast and walk us through our next question.
Yeah, we'll go from west to east, so the Alaskan coast first. But I wanted to, based on those ripest opportunities for change that you all had mentioned, I'm curious to know what's one insight that you've had over the course of the past 14 months that was an aha moment for you. Maybe just that time where you kind of stopped, paused, and said, like, wow, this is something that I didn't expect. This is a learning that is brand new for me, and is really going to be helpful in informing my approach for the work moving forward. So curious to know what those aha moments were for you, starting with you, Mel. I know you're an aha factory.
I know we had lots of ahas. I think as everyone did, right? I think one of the ones that really we have grappled with in terms of our department, our teaching and learning department, was to realize that we had great resources available and teachers didn't realize it. So when we went off to spring break in March of 2020, and we just never came back to school. And so we had, out of our instructional tech department, step sheets for how to use all of our adopted technology. We had tutorials for parents on Google Classroom that were very specific to accessing through our district and our ClassLink and things like that. And it was amazing. You know, we had certain people that we had worked with that knew about them, and then realizing that there were a lot of folks who didn't realize them, who didn't know about them. And so getting that word out. And a key piece of that really was looking at our principals. And so good conversations, you know, with our superintendent and our leadership team about our principals have not been freed up enough to be really instructional leaders. And so therefore they did not feel equipped always to help with the stress of teachers saying, oh my gosh, how do we do this? And so, you know, I don't know why it was an aha. It makes sense, of course, now, but realizing that we really needed to focus on our principals with instruction and instructional tech so that they could help point teachers to the right direction, and they felt competent to be able to deal with the crises in their buildings.
That's a great insight, Mel. Like I say, hindsight is 2021. So we're constantly looking back and realizing that there's a lot of learning that has gone on. Phil, what's an aha for you?
I'll give you a quick three. One is 21-22, this next academic year, is not an orthogonal or linear reach from 2020 in numerous ways. Our bandwidth has doubled since we returned back to school, but that's just a reflection of students all with one-to-one devices, knowing how to use them, teachers who have gone through 4 shifts, quite frankly, in the last 2 years. So one is 21-22 academic year will be something in which we will be ready for, but won't be something we can measure based on the past. And some examples of that is the notion that beyond the school grounds is another playground. And that one we must innovate and provide equitable access to learning there as well. And I think the other thing too, and I mentioned it earlier, this notion of learner variability, I think we've, from the conversation here, there's real good affinity with the notion that students aren't all the same, nor are their life journeys and their learning journeys the same. And as I've looked at our, personalized blended learning that was moving teaching practices before COVID, and then in the spring of 2020, that emergency crisis online learning, then the online learning that was more formally prepared, and then concurrent learning. I've seen that teachers sometimes were better at one game than the next. But imagine playing basketball, then you're playing soccer, then you're playing indoor soccer, and then you're asked to play, volleyball. That's the kind of thing that's happened. And some teachers I've noticed were better at one of those games than the other, but they've built strength along the way. Now the challenge will be, how to take those strengths and bring them all to the new normal in a way that suits their strengths, and so that they can play their best game. And students will always learn when teachers are playing their best game, and it will show up with confidence. So I think that's one of the ahas I've been watching, the shifts that our PLI team and others are guiding.
Yeah, great insight, Phil. We can always count on you for a sports metaphor too. Laura and Manami, what are some ahas that you've had over the course of the past 14 months?
I think that there's two specific examples that I can speak about regarding how amazing our teachers have been able to be this past year. I remember when we first started this whole school shutdown in Syracuse, we partnered with public broadcasting to actually record our teachers teaching to a TV screen with no children in front of them. That was actually broadcast on public broadcasting all day, every day. And watching and listening, being so proud of people who were not actors and actresses, who were trying to figure out how to fake something on a television screen. And I was like, my people are on TV. And then going in some virtual walkthroughs and seeing some children be so excited that they saw the teacher who was in the walkthrough, who was on TV, and they're so excited about science all of a sudden. And they could talk about the experiment that this teacher had walked them through on WCNY the week before. It was really, really cool. And then to see in the corner of my computer screen a little first grader, after I watch this teacher teach children how to read on the computer, this little first grader say goodbye to the teacher. "I love you, Miss Mayberry." And just so heartwarming to see how we always say if we have really high expectations for our students, then they will rise to them. And we all of a sudden ramped up the expectations for our teachers in ways that probably felt impossible to achieve. And they rose to those expectations, even when there were so many unknowns. And I just am super proud of them and really excited about some of the things that I just never thought would be possible to do over a computer screen. I really didn't know that you could teach kids to read over the computer. And I'm really excited that our people have been able to figure that out. And I just know that we'll be able to figure out what we need to do for the kids when we get them back in person full time again too.
Manami, anything you want to add? That was a really, really powerful examples, Laura. Thank you for sharing.
Just on the same note of just the biggest aha has just been around how incredible our staff and students are and how strong they are. And just we always talk about how important socio-emotional learning is, but we didn't really have any clear understanding or vision for what that actually looked like in practice. And I think that this year has really shown us that we really do have to spend some time building up our staff and encouraging them to take care of their own socio-emotional health. And it was apparent this year that that is important, and we have to prioritize it, even though sometimes it might not feel like that is the work of a school district. We have to protect our staff and help them be socially and emotionally sound, because they really, like, none of us, we can't give what we don't have. And we need them to be able to give that to our students.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the saying goes, you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think we're in districts across the country that we're working with, we're noticing that emphasis on people first and kind of a human-centered approach is definitely the way to go as we think about what the future of teaching and learning looks like in our districts. So viewing our teachers and students as people before we view them as, employees and names on a roster sheet for sure. I think I'm going to kick it over to Christina. Do you have the next question for our panel?
I do, and thank you all for your reflections on your ahas and possibilities. Something that we have heard from a lot of the districts that we've been working with is how this was really an opportunity to understand some of the walls or barriers that exist and how we can start to push against some of those as we dismantle systems that maybe didn't work for all of our students or all of our teachers or all of our community members. So Phil, would love to hear from you. What have you learned are some boundaries that you can start to push against more, or maybe start to push in the coming years?
Yeah, I think some of it is taking the lead from the skills competency work that occurs within college and career readiness learning pathways and bringing those into the elementary level curriculum as well. And some of those actually are, from a learning science standpoint, shown to be really effective from a learning experience standpoint, such as collaboration and the use of technology. So those sorts of things. So taking that graduate profile that we have and trying to make sure it shows up throughout the curriculum and beyond the classroom as well. And lots of examples of that. We've got one teacher, one of the elementary I happened to attend when I was younger, but he's teaching students about drones. And this is an elementary school. And so you can, and highly engaging, they can learn lots of wonderful things, have fun at the same time, and then build real world skills. The other is taking and asking ourselves beyond the content, what other things help learners grow? And things like goal setting, reflection, and real world problem solving, and integrating that in as well. So I think we can push the boundaries about, what are the learning objectives and things that need to get measured as well. I think the other is innovations in teaching practices. How do we have high quality tier 1 instruction in a way that brings to bear data in a way that really couldn't before? You have 35 students. How can you quickly know who needs to be after the first teach in a small group to get a second first teach, and or who might be able to drive ahead? And we've seen good practices of and use of that data over the last couple of years, but it's available now to students and teachers. I think the other thing is structures and routines from a social emotional wellness standpoint help, and they also help for learning, and they create consistency. And that's where I think we're seeing more of that across the grades, and as a way to better help students with the learning. The other thing I think that we can push further, and we're doing some serious work around that, is taking all these new signals and turning them into insights that help guide where our interventions might need to be, figure out what's working, where it's working, and how do we scale things out as well. And yeah, the other things that we need to start pushing, we've looked at voice and choice. How might we look at pathways and pace? How might we start to reconsider bell schedules? So some big systems change kind of questions are being asked, and that's and it's a challenge in large systems to get change to scale across and to actually have learning reach new targets. But I think we've learned through the pandemic that high expectations with high supports, students will show up, our teachers, our staff will as well. So we do need to imagine new possibilities and nudge and push along the way.
Thanks, Phil. There were a couple of things that really jumped out as you were sharing around taking signals and turning them into insights, really paying close attention to the information that you're having, and also the way that you were talking about pushing the boundary of transparency around who gets the data. Does it stay with the teacher or go to the student? So I think there are some really powerful things that are happening in your district that are going to be exciting to continue to follow. Mel, what about you? What are some boundaries that you're either starting to push or thinking about pushing moving forward?
I think that idea of transparency of data is something that we're discovering as well. So when teachers have had families at home watching them teach, and hearing them explain assignments, and realizing that some students are doing really well and others aren't, things like grades become more of a discussion, and where are our students in terms of data, and especially I think at our secondary level, really looking at what does the objective data say about where our kids are, and then where do we need to go to raise all the boats. And so those are conversations that have been uncomfortable for some of our staff about letting other people see where are groups of students failing, not just specifically in the district, but at specific schools with specific teachers and specific classes, and that starts to feel very personal for teachers, and especially because we want to celebrate all of the wins they've had. But this also is an opportunity as we come into next fall to say, here's where our students' gaps really are, and let's not talk about curriculum, let's talk about what do we want kids to learn and where are they starting. So that's for teachers who have had lesson plans for a couple of years. And I was a secondary English teacher, so I always pick on secondary teachers. But, those who, you pull out your lesson plans for the first week of school and you tweak them a little bit, but this is not business as usual. So pushing teachers to embrace that I think is a real opportunity. The other thing that's super exciting for me is to start looking at so we had students who were fully e-learning, who chose that, but they were still enrolled in their home school. So sort of this idea of, a family may decide to do their cores in middle school at home and then come into the middle school for just their electives or come in for music, or a student who might decide I'm going to come in for an in-person class in math and I'm going to do these 2 online and then these 3 I'm going to do up at the university. And those kind of we've not always been comfortable with sort of starting to blur those boundaries between our e-learning and our in-person and early college. And so that is exciting to me, that we can really start looking at students advocating for themselves for their own pathways.
Mel, that idea of blurring the boundaries and thinking about how you re-examine the boundary of location as you're really reinventing the options for students and their families is really exciting. Manami and Laura, what are some of the boundaries that you all are thinking about up in Syracuse?
Well, I'm actually hoping we have fewer boundaries, fewer divisions across, what we expect for certain groups, certain schools, certain parts of the city. It's all, I think, connected to what I hope here in Syracuse we can get to, where we actually move the margins to the middle and we're actually doing what's best for everyone. And that means we have a lot of choice and a lot of options. And it's complicated to do that in a large system, but I think it's possible here. And I think that the ways we're going to do that is we're going to continue to elevate our students as leaders, continue to elevate their voices and learn from them. And we're going to have to continue to work deeply and ongoing around our level of cultural responsiveness, both to our staff and our students and the community of Syracuse at large. We've had a lot of opportunity to reflect, I think, over the past 14 years about who we are, where we are as a city, and how we want to treat each other, how we want to be treated. And I think that our students have been really strong leaders and guides in that regard. So I think if we can stop having all these boundaries, we'll actually get to where we need to be.
Manami, anything that you would like to add before we wrap up this question?
I just have something unrelated to anything that has to do with actual teaching and learning, but I think that we can push the boundary of where we do work from and when we do work. I feel like there are actually positions that it is okay to do that from home at 3 o'clock in the morning, if that's what floats your boat, And I think education is such a traditional field that it takes us a really long time to get there. But I think that we're at a place that maybe we could push that a little bit.
Thank you, Manami, for bringing up the way that we can push boundaries for adults too, as well as students. And I think something, Laura, that you all started speaking about was community and the power of the Syracuse community. So thank you for bringing that back up for this question. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gabby.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this next question because you all have sort of spoken to it in one way or another. Phil, you mentioned this idea of like thinking about the how might we questions. How might we reschedule or restructure the school day? Manami, you just mentioned how might we rethink sort of the experience for adults as well. And Mel, you even mentioned this idea of not thinking of e-learning and in-person learning as like separate, but thinking about how we can actually merge those together. The way that we have sort of been thinking about this are the what if questions, right? So what if there were no, classroom walls, right? What if learning could sort of happen anywhere? What if students could navigate through learning experiences in a much more personalized way? What if we could rethink how we define and expect success? And so, not limiting you to those questions that I just asked, but what ifs have you just been dying to tackle? And what are you waiting for? What's sort of the cue that's going to give you the go ahead to tackle those? And Mel, if I can start with you, I'd love to hear what's happening there.
This is kind of a hard question. I think, someone, it might have been Laura who has said, you want to change everything at once. I think we've been really trying to push all the boundaries we can while we have everybody sort of off kilter. Let's make all the change we can and then try to bring them back in. I think that the core for me, and I think some of the others have talked about this, is we have seen such amazing student advocacy. In the beginning, parents would call and say, I haven't gotten an email from the teacher, but the student had been communicating with the teacher every single day. And so that shift of that ownership of students and helping parents and teachers get there has been really exciting. And so for me, my next step is, how do we really center students as we look at different boundaries, as we talk about grading, as we talk about, credits, and can you do credit recovery for 2 classes in 1 period and blow the mind of the computer systems? Let's listen to the students and let them really help us drive that next piece. So we're really looking for some ways to engage students in those meaningful conversations, which has not been something that we've always done. And so I'm hopeful that that voice of the students and the parents, having seen their students in action as advocates, will help shift a little bit of that.
That's awesome, Mel. What about you, Laura, Manami? I'll go back to you because we'll sort of go back and forth across the coast. What ifs are you excited to tackle in Syracuse? And Manami, I'm going to start with you because I know Laura's been going first for us a lot.
This is hard because there's so many that I'm having trouble landing on one. But one of the things that not to speak for Laura, but we're both really excited about is just we saw so much power in our units that were integrated this year, and what students learned and the amount of hands-on learning that we were able to do, both virtually and in person, and how much kids love that. And we're really excited to kick off some project-based learning and really be thoughtful about how we do this, and how this leads into our CTE high schools and programs, and just really making sure that we're asking kids, what do you want to learn? How do you want to learn it? And helping, including them in the design as well. So that's what we're excited about.
I love that. And I noticed a comment coming in about that's a good boundary to push, is making decisions after we sort of engage with students as well. Phil, what about you? What ifs are you dying to tackle?
Well, there's some what ifs that have been informed already by innovations within our system and student voice. And some of these came before the pandemic, but inspire us as we move beyond it. Our alt-ed schools, for example, changed their schedules to incorporate goal setting and reflection. We actually started a virtual school that will continue to incorporate those sort of innovations and continue to stretch what's possible. But I'll just mention a few others that we're looking at as well. How do we use AI, artificial intelligence, for example, for adaptive accelerated learning in digital apps, but also analytics that will inform those digital apps about what's the right playlist for the student, and what are the learner pathways, and how do we guide that, and then also accommodate the uniqueness of learners along the way. The Connect to Learn piece I talked about, it's a multi-layered approach to solve for equitable access to rich learning experiences beyond the school. And one thing we're doing is actually building out our own cellular network, 15 schools as towers, and as one of those layers to improve access. And that's where we're going to have to continue to imagine what's necessary, gather data, advocate at a state level, and actually build infrastructure. Why? Because anchor institutions are the ones that have to do that in the next 5 years. The policies and practices aren't happening within the traditional carriers. The other one is building, this is an important one, is building digital systems that accommodate learner pathways and pace. and the blurred boundaries that we talked about across secondary learning opportunities, where it could be, school, this high school, that high school, wherever the courses were available, college, MOOCs, LinkedIn Learning, all those sorts of things are what constitute learning and getting ready for, the iterations of learning and work that will be in these students' life. So I think the conversation's been stellar. I think we'll all acknowledge that this pandemic has forced us all to put in place the necessary conditions for modern learning. So now the question is, how will we better prepare all of our students for their, what I call their hashtag as yet imagined futures? And that's the possibility, because the foundation is in place.
Incredible. I feel like there's so many nuggets, takeaways, like quotes I want to put on a poster just from your answers. We do have some questions coming in from the chat, so we want to make sure we spend the last few minutes on that, and I'll let Drew walk us through the first one.
Yeah, first of all, just shout out to Angela and Anne, who are our chat rock stars today, just bringing a lot of really valuable reflections, questions, and thoughts to the conversation. So thank you both for keeping the chat going, and for everyone else who's contributed their thoughts as well. Not too late. You can continue to do so. But wanted to call out one of the questions that Angela brought up earlier, and I'll ask the panel. Anyone can answer based on how the spirit moves you. But what are your thoughts on learning loss versus schooling loss, using that terminology, and how can we as educators approach this, the mindset around these terms, and how we communicate what has happened and what we are doing to respond to that? Anyone can feel free to jump in.
I'll start by saying there's a whole lot more to learning and growth and readiness than formal learning. And I think students have definitely experienced that in various ways. One of my colleagues showed me a picture of 4 students in a hotel room where they live, and they had created some different separations, but they were all engaged in learning. And so again, when we create the opportunities and the right structures and support, students will choose. And imagine what those students 20 years from now will look back and how they all supported each other, and how they actually showed up on a regular basis despite the pandemic to further their learning. What skills were developed through that experience?
Thanks, Phil. We'll go to Laura. I think you wanted to chime in as well.
I really just wanted to echo what you just said, in terms of we have learned a tremendous amount over the past 14 months. Some lessons I wish we didn't have had to have learned. I wish we weren't forced to have learned them. I see our students online. I see an 8-year-old with a toddler on her lap doing her assignment with her teacher. I mean, that child is learning all kinds of things, just not maybe in a traditional classroom. And some of our high school students who literally are working to help support their families, doing their coursework around their job hours. I personally have learned a tremendous amount over this past 14 months, just in terms of how I need to be on a computer screen, how people are looking at me for information, and how I've got to make sure I share everything I can to try to make sure that people feel okay as they can feel in circumstances like this. And lots of times when I have not felt okay myself, just really trying to I think it's important that at some point we're all going to be able to breathe, and we're going to be able to really think about what this has taught us. Like you said, 20 years from now, we're going to be looking back at this COVID generation of students, and we're going to be so impressed with what they've been able to accomplish when they face these really have what it felt like insurmountable challenges sometimes over the past year. And I just think that we can reframe the way we think about where we learn. Gabby, you said, what if there were no walls for schools? What if schools weren't limited to a particular building or place? And I think that we're just going to continue to grow and think about what learning looks like in addition to what we traditionally do in a 48-minute period in a classroom.
Great, thanks, Laura. Mel, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think we all, there's agreement. We've been really saying we're not talking about sort of learning loss, right? An opportunity to learn is not a disability. Let's go. What we have found is that we're really going to need to work with our parents. We have a lot of parents, especially they think about, well, when my older child went through Mrs. Hadaway's class and did all of these great projects, my third grader now didn't get to do that. So somehow they're deficient. And so really giving principals and teachers tools to talk with parents about, let's talk about what they've learned. Let's talk about what's important. Let's talk about what normal is, right? Everyone thinks that we're going to go back. There's a sense of normal being 2018 or, and we don't want to go back to that way. We're moving forward in different ways. And so really, I think helping principals, parents, teachers have the vocabulary and some talking points to think about how do we frame that conversation around a growth mindset and around, the fact that your kid's going to be okay. Not just kids in Fairbanks, Alaska, as proven by this, have not had a normal experience. And so when they get to college, the colleges will know that, in 2020, there were lots of high school kids who perhaps had weird grades. And so just talking through that and giving the time for parents who want the best for their kids to work through what that looks like.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your insights and your ideas and for using this space to collaborate and to problem solve. During our webinar, we really thought about what were the things that we wanted to celebrate, what were some of the things that maybe we needed to re-examine, and what are some of the lessons that we really want to take with us as we reimagine what's possible moving forward. So we wanted to take a second to thank Mel, Phil, Laura, and Manami for participating today, for sharing your experiences, and hopefully having an impact on those who are watching and learning from this group of incredible leaders. So thank you all for this time together today, and we can't wait to continue learning with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.